The ledger hit the floor first, then Solange. Two colleagues froze. A third scrambled from her chair and knocked it over doing it. Someone said her name once, then louder. A fourth person appeared in the doorway of the accounting suite, already reaching for her phone. Nobody heard the elevator open. Nobody noticed the man walking down the corridor until he was already in the room. Ambrose Fallon looked at the woman lying motionless between two filing cabinets, her reading glasses still pushed up into her hair, a pen still loosely gripped in one hand. Then he looked at the four people standing around her, not one of them doing anything useful. Has anyone called an ambulance? 3 people moved at once. His head of security materialized beside him. "Sir, I can handle." "Get the car." Ambrose was already crouching. "Tell them we're coming to the private entrance at Mercy General, now." "Sir, if you want, one of the men can carry." "Garrow." His voice was quiet. Everyone in the room went still. "Get the car." He gathered Solange Keir into his arms like she weighed nothing, though she didn't. She was a solidly built woman. Everyone who had ever underestimated her on that basis had eventually regretted it. Her head fell against his shoulder. He could feel how shallow her breathing was. The accounting staff stared. Nobody had ever seen Ambrose Fallon carry anyone. The private wing of Mercy General had a security checkpoint that most hospitals didn't. The nurses on that floor had learned, over 3 years, not to ask too many questions about who arrived there or what name appeared on the intake forms. They had also learned that when a certain man came through those doors, everything else became secondary. The attending physician was already waiting. "Severe dehydration," he said, 40 minutes later, finding Ambrose in the corridor. "Electrolyte imbalance. Her blood pressure dropped dangerously low. We think she's been running on almost nothing for at least 2 days, possibly more." Ambrose said nothing. "She's stable." The doctor paused. "But Mr. Fallon, another 12 hours of whatever she was doing, and we'd be having a very different conversation right now." The corridor was quiet for a moment. "Will there be lasting damage?" "We don't believe so, but she needs rest, real rest, not the kind where she answers emails from a hospital bed." Ambrose looked through the small window in the door. Solange lay against the pillow with an IV in her arm, her face no longer the frightening grey it had been when he carried her in. She looked young. He had always known she was 29. Somehow, seeing her like this made him understand it differently. He pulled out his phone. His assistant answered before the second ring. "Cancel this afternoon. The Hargrove negotiation is at 3, and they've already..." "Cancel it." A brief pause. "Tomorrow morning's briefing?" "Tomorrow, too. The foundation dinner is..." "All of it." His voice didn't rise. It never needed to. "Every appointment until I tell you otherwise. If anyone pushes back, tell them to contact my lawyer." Not one member of his staff argued. His second call went to the director of operations for Fallon Hospitality Group, the legitimate face of his considerable empire. "I want 6 months of timesheets from the accounting division. Every overtime log, every shift change request, every weekend sign-in." The director, a careful man named Lewin, swallowed audibly. "That's... Yes, sir. By when?" "By the time I finish this coffee." He had been sitting in the same chair outside Solange's room for 4 hours. A nurse had offered twice to call him if anything changed. He had thanked her and stayed anyway. "She must be very important to you," the nurse said on her 3rd pass. Ambrose considered the answer for longer than he expected to. "She works for me." The nurse smiled in the polite way people smile when they don't believe what they're hearing. "Of course." He looked back at the window. For the first time in what felt like years, he didn't have an answer that felt accurate. By 7 the following morning, Ambrose was seated at the head of his private conference table at Fallon Tower, and the surface in front of him was covered in timesheets. The director of operations stood on one side. The head of HR, a sharp-eyed woman named Dorothea Fenn, stood on the other. 3 senior managers completed the row. Nobody sat. Nobody spoke first. Ambrose turned a page, then another. The math was not possible, and yet here it was, documented. Solange Keir had worked an average of 61 hours a week for 37 consecutive months. She had taken 4 days of personal leave in 3 years. She had covered weekend shifts for 6 different colleagues, approved emergency replacements for 2 others, and on at least 11 separate occasions had stayed past midnight completing work that had been assigned to employees who called out sick. On paper, she should have quit 18 months ago. Explain this. He kept his eyes on the page. Dorothea cleared her throat. She volunteered for most of those shifts. Nothing was formally assigned above 40 hours. She volunteered. He said it without inflection. She always insisted she didn't mind. Ambrose looked up. Slowly. He had a way of looking at people that made them feel as though the temperature in the room had dropped 5 degrees. No one elaborated. Then Harold Keach, who was 63 years old and had worked in accounting since before Ambrose was born, made a soft sound and spoke without being addressed. "Permission to say something, sir." Ambrose gave a slight nod. Harold straightened his jacket. Sol didn't volunteer because she loved overtime. She volunteered because she couldn't watch someone struggle and do nothing. He paused. "When my wife had her hip surgery last spring, I missed 4 days. Sol covered every one of my reports without being asked. When I came back, everything was done. She'd even formatted the quarterly summary the way I like it, not the standard template." He shook his head. "She never mentioned it." A junior auditor spoke next, quietly. "When I started, I made an error in a vendor reconciliation. It would have been a significant problem. Sol found it before anyone else did, corrected it, and told me privately. She never put it in a report. She said everyone makes mistakes the first month." Another woman, mid-level, had been with the company 2 years, added without looking up. "My babysitter cancelled the night of the Hargrove filing deadline. Sol told me to go home. She said she'd handle my portion. I found out later she worked until 4 in the morning." One after another, they spoke. Not dramatic stories, small ones. A lunch brought to someone who had forgotten to eat. A spreadsheet rebuilt after a server crash. A reference letter written on a weekend. A birthday remembered for a security guard whose own team had forgotten. The room became quieter as each story landed, not louder. Then Dorothea said, almost reluctantly, there was something else. Ambrose waited. "The tea." He went still. Dorothea continued. "For approximately the past 22 months, someone has been leaving a fresh cup of tea outside your office at 7 a.m. The kitchen staff confirmed it wasn't them. We traced it to Sol." She paused. "She apparently noticed that you were developing tension headaches. She'd overheard you mention it to Garrow, and concluded that your 6-cup coffee habit was contributing. So she started leaving an alternative." The room was silent. Ambrose thought about the past 22 months, the mug that was always there when he arrived. The small folded notes he had assumed came from some wellness initiative his assistant had quietly enrolled him in. Notes that said things like, "Peppermint today. You have the afternoon meetings. Caffeine will make it worse." Or, "This one's for sleep. You're still here past midnight." Or simply, "Drink the water too." He had, without ever questioning it, done exactly what they said. "She changed my habits," he said. Not a question. Harold almost smiled. "You obeyed her for almost 2 years without knowing who you were obeying, sir." Ambrose set down the report he was holding. For a man whose word restructured companies, whose decisions moved money across 3 continents, whose silence in a negotiation had made grown men apologize for things they hadn't done, It was a 29-year-old bookkeeper who had quietly corrected his diet, his sleep schedule, and his caffeine intake with nothing more than loose-leaf tea and a few folded pieces of paper. He reached for the next folder. It was thinner than the others. Dorothea placed it in front of him without speaking. He opened it. A resignation letter, 18 months old, unsigned. Clipped behind it was an internal HR complaint form, never submitted. He read it quietly. An account of a conversation that had taken place in the second-floor break room, overheard by 2 witnesses who had never come forward. A male colleague, now no longer with the company, had said, in front of 3 other people, that Saul was sharp but better kept in the back office. That clients noticed that kind of thing. That someone who looked like her wasn't the face the company needed visible. Solange had written it all down, dated it, attached witness names, and then put it in a folder and never sent it. She had come back to work the following Monday and covered a double shift. The conference room was utterly still. Ambrose closed the folder. He thought about every morning she had smiled when he passed the accounting suite. Every time he had overheard her calmly walking a nervous junior employee through a process she'd already explained twice. Every time she had noticed something small. The tension in his jaw. The fact that he still hadn't eaten by 2 in the afternoon. And done something about it without making it a conversation. She had been carrying all of it. The exhaustion, the humiliation, the deliberate cruelty that had never been addressed. And she had still found enough space in her day to leave tea for a man who hadn't even known her name for the first 6 months she worked for him. He rose from his chair. I want a full review of HR oversight procedures. Every complaint that wasn't formally filed. Every record showing voluntary overtime exceeding 20% above baseline. His voice was steady, and I want to understand how someone in this building told a member of my staff that she was better kept out of sight. And that conversation produced no consequences. He looked toward the window. The hospital was 5 blocks from here. No one, he said, almost to himself, is going to make her carry any of this alone again. Morning came in thin and grey through the hospital blinds. Solange became aware of it in pieces. The sound first, a steady beeping, then the weight of the blanket, then the unfamiliar ceiling. She lay still and tried to remember what had come before. The reconciliation report, the binder on the high shelf, reaching, then nothing. She turned her head. The chair beside her bed was occupied by a man in a dark suit. His jacket was folded over the back of the chair. His sleeves were rolled to the forearm. He was asleep, or nearly so, with his chin lowered and his hands resting on his knees. One of those hands was holding hers. She hadn't noticed that immediately. When she did, she felt the warmth of it all at once. Steady, unhurried, the kind of touch that wasn't performing anything. She was still working out how to feel about it when his eyes opened. Ambrose Fallon looked at her without moving. "Hey," she said. Her voice came out rougher than expected. "Hey," he said. A beat. "You should. I'm fine. You don't have to stay, She tried to push herself upright. The room tilted sideways. "Easy." He was on his feet before she could fall, one hand steady at her shoulder. The doctor said no fast movements. She let him steady her. Then she looked down at their joined hands, then back up at him. "Mr. Fallon, I know. I was holding your. I know." He didn't let go. He also didn't make it strange, which was the thing she wasn't expecting. He just waited until the room settled and she had her bearings, and when she finally pulled her hand back, he released her without ceremony. She sat against the pillow and stared at the blanket. "I'm sorry," she said. "About the timing." The Hargrove reconciliation wasn't finished, and I know the quarterly review is next week. So if you need someone else to cover the... Sol. She stopped. He sat back down in the chair, and looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not frustrated, not cold. Something that didn't fit any version of Ambrose Fallon she had filed away over 4 years. "You collapsed," he said, "and the first thing you did when you woke up was apologize for the inconvenience." She opened her mouth. "You didn't ask where you were," he continued. "You didn't ask how long you'd been unconscious. You didn't ask how you were doing." A pause. "You apologized." The room was very quiet. "I caused problems," she said, softer now. "You worked until your body gave out." His voice didn't change in volume or pace. "Those are not the same thing." Her eyes filled before she could stop them. She pressed her lips together and looked toward the window. "I've always been the person who's fine," she said. "The one who handles it. I didn't want to be." She stopped. "Who what? Who needs something?" She almost laughed, and it came out uneven. "It feels wrong." "The strongest people," Ambrose said, "are usually the ones who collapse in silence. Because they spend so long making sure everyone else is held up, they forget they're allowed to get tired." A tear made it down her cheek before she could catch it. She wiped it immediately and looked away. "Now you're going to tell me to stop apologizing," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "I was going to give you another few seconds first." She laughed, a real one, small and startled, and it surprised both of them enough that for a moment neither spoke. Outside the room, Constance Fallon had arrived without anyone noticing. She stood at the corridor window and watched her nephew sit beside a hospital bed, his phone untouched on the table, every cancelled meeting apparently the furthest thing from his mind. She had been watching for 10 minutes. He hadn't looked away from Solange once. Constance had spent 20 years wondering whether the boy she'd helped raise was capable of letting anyone close enough to matter. She had her answer now. He already had. He just hadn't said it yet. The Fallon Group's annual Impact Gala was held in the grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel, and Solange almost didn't go. She had been back at work for 2 weeks, carefully scheduled, her hours enforced by Ambrose himself, with the quiet authority of a man who did not negotiate on this particular subject. And Constance had appeared at her apartment the previous evening to inform her that not attending was not an option. "You've spent 3 years making sure every event in that building runs smoothly," Constance had told her. "The least you can do is let someone serve you a glass of champagne." She stood now at the edge of the ballroom in a deep burgundy dress, not borrowed, not designer, just carefully chosen, and reminded herself she only had to stay 1 hour. She had not anticipated Cecile Nast. The operations director found her within 4 minutes. Cecile was a composed, angular woman with a talent for making professional cruelty sound perfectly reasonable, and the internal review of her department had not yet concluded, which meant she was technically still present at company events. She crossed the room with a champagne flute and a smile that stopped somewhere below her eyes. "Sol, back so soon. You look rested." "Good evening, Cecile." "I have to say." Cecile tilted her head, letting her voice carry just enough to reach the nearby tables. "The timing of everything was rather extraordinary, wasn't it? You collapse. Ambrose cancels his entire schedule. Suddenly there's a review of the whole department. And here you are at the gala." She sipped her champagne. "It makes you wonder who benefited most from all the attention." The conversations around them had gone quieter. Solange kept her voice even. "I don't know what you mean." "I just mean, well," Cecile smiled. "Plenty of people work hard without turning it into a whole situation. One has to wonder whether the whole thing was a little." She searched for the word, orchestrated. "I wasn't performing anything," Sol said quietly. "I was working. I passed out." "Of course." Cecile stepped closer. "I'm sure the doctors were very persuasive, and Ambrose has always had a soft spot for a certain kind of story. The question is whether the story was earned or simply well placed. The words landed the way that particular kind of cruelty always did, not loud enough to cause a scene, just precise enough to cause doubt. Solange felt her face go still the way it always had, the practiced stillness she had built in break rooms and hallways and HR offices, where no one had ever thought to ask how she was doing. She lowered her eyes. Cecile shifted. It might have looked like an accident. The angle of her turn, the positioning of her elbow, except that it wasn't, and the two people standing closest to them saw it clearly. And Solange felt the deliberate pressure against her shoulder send her stumbling sideways on marble in heels. She didn't fall. An arm came around her waist with the kind of certainty that didn't pause to calculate. She didn't need to look to know whose it was. Ambrose had one hand at her side, steadying her, and when she turned, he was looking at her with that expression, the one she was starting to learn to read. Are you hurt? No. He held her gaze a moment. Then he turned to face the room. The ballroom had gone so quiet that the chandelier hum was audible. Ambrose did not raise his voice. 3 weeks ago, he said, the woman standing beside me worked over 70 hours across 3 days because she couldn't bring herself to leave unfinished work when a colleague needed covering. He paused, letting the silence carry its own weight. The physician who treated her told me that another 12 hours of that pace might have been unsurvivable. Nobody moved. Over the past 3 years, she covered shifts for a colleague whose mother had a stroke. She corrected errors for junior staff and never put them on record. She arranged transportation for a warehouse employee whose car was repossessed on her own lunch break without being asked. His voice was measured and deliberate, each word placed like a stone. She left tea outside my office every morning for nearly 2 years because she noticed I was getting headaches and quietly decided to do something about it. He paused. Someone in this building once told her she was better kept out of sight, that she wasn't the right face for the company. His gaze moved briefly to Cecile. That conversation happened. No one was held accountable for it. That changes tonight. Cecile's champagne flute was very still in her hand. And tonight, someone suggested that this woman, who worked herself into a hospital bed, did so with calculation. He let the sentence settle. I don't have a word for that kind of reasoning that's appropriate for a public event. The applause began at one table, then spread. Then people were standing, and then more. And Solange stood in the center of it, feeling like she was at the bottom of a deep, warm pool, watching the surface shimmer above her, stunned and breathing, and somehow still here. Ambrose turned to her and offered his hand, not as her employer, simply as the person standing next to her. She looked at it for one breath. Then she placed her hand in his. Cecile Nast's employment was terminated by the end of the following week. The internal review confirmed what the timesheets had suggested, a pattern of selective enforcement, the deliberate overloading of high-performing staff who asked too few questions, and the systematic disregarding of complaints that never reached formal filing because the people who might have filed them had no faith in the process. Ambrose read every page himself. Then he started rewriting the policies. Within 30 days, Fallon Hospitality Group had announced the most comprehensive employee welfare initiative in its history. Overtime caps with real enforcement, anonymous reporting systems with independent review, mental health leave classified alongside medical leave, managers evaluated not only on revenue but on staff retention and team well-being scores. Every proposal that came back from his desk came back covered in handwriting. No employee should work through a meal because there's no one to cover a break. This clause is bureaucratic cover. Rewrite it in plain English so people actually understand their rights. What happens when someone files a complaint and their direct manager is the subject? Answer this before we publish." The board understood, without needing to be told, that none of this had originated in a conference room. It had originated beside a hospital bed at 7 in the morning, when a man who had never sat still for more than 3 minutes had sat in an uncomfortable chair for 18 hours because he could not make himself leave. Solange returned to Fallon Tower on a Monday and found her new schedule waiting on her desk. She read it 3 times. "This is half my previous hours," she said when she found Ambrose in his office. Closer to 60%. He didn't look up from his desk. "I'm perfectly capable of." "I know," he set his pen down. "The schedule isn't negotiable." She leaned against the doorframe. Most bosses try to get more work out of their employees. Not less. Most employees don't leave tea outside my door for 2 years out of genuine concern for my blood pressure. The warmth reached her face before she could stop it. "You found out it was me." "Harold told me the second day." "Harold," she said with feeling. He was proud of himself. The corner of Ambrose's mouth lifted. He used the phrase, "She's been managing you for years," and seemed to find it very satisfying. She laughed, and he watched her do it the way he had started watching her do a lot of things, as though it was worth paying attention to. Their conversations had come to look like this, more and more. He found reasons to pass the accounting suite. She lingered in the corridor outside his office longer than the errand required. Neither of them named it directly. Nobody on staff named it either, at least not where either of them could hear, though the knowing looks exchanged across conference tables had been growing increasingly unsubtle. One evening, late enough that most of the building had cleared, Solange was rearranging the white dahlia arrangement in the lobby. The florist had been delayed. She'd noticed the flowers drooping, and she'd handled it the same way she had always handled things she noticed, quietly, without waiting to be asked. Ambrose stopped on his way out. "That's not your job," he said. "I know." He was quiet for a moment, watching her work. "You do that everywhere," he said. "Notice what's needed and fill it." She kept her hands on the stems. Old habit. Sol. She looked at him. He moved closer. Not much. Just enough that the space between them changed. "You said something in the hospital, that you've always been the person who handles it." "Who's fine. I remember." "Did anyone ever ask whether that's what you wanted?" His voice was unhurried. "Or did they assume you didn't need anything because you never asked?" She took her time answering. "Both," she said finally, "and I let them assume it." He nodded once. "I don't want to assume anything about what you need." He paused. "I want to ask." The lobby was very quiet. Solange set the last dahlia and turned to face him fully, and whatever had been quietly accumulating between them over months. Through hospital corridors and late-night offices, and the particular stillness of conversations neither of them had been willing to end first, she let it arrive. He reached for her hand the same way he had in the hospital. Not a demand, an offering. She closed the distance herself. 6 months later, Solange Keir's official title at Fallon Hospitality Group was Director of Employee Compliance and Workplace Standards. Industry reporters wrote carefully worded pieces about the unconventional appointment. Inside the company, no one questioned it. There was no one more qualified to recognize the exact shape of silent exhaustion than the woman who had nearly been consumed by it. At the group's first annual staff recognition event, added to the calendar at Ambrose's direct instruction, employees filled the conference hall and spoke at the podium. A kitchen manager described taking bereavement leave for the first time in 14 years without fearing what she'd find when she returned. A junior auditor talked about a workplace complaint that was actually investigated and resolved within 30 days. A driver who had been with the company for 9 years stood up and said, simply, that he had attended his daughter's graduation last spring that he had never been able to before, that he hadn't known how to say thank you until now. Solange sat in the front row, with her fingers pressed together in her lap, so she wouldn't cry in front of everyone. She mostly failed. A reporter raised her hand near the end. "Mr. Fallon, you promoted someone from a bookkeeping role, without traditional leadership credentials, to one of the most consequential HR positions in your company. What was your reasoning?" Every camera in the room turned toward him. Ambrose glanced toward Solange before he answered. Something shifted in his expression, quiet, specific to her, before he spoke. Because she spent 3 years noticing what everyone else had learned not to see. A pause. And because she'd taught me that the people most worth listening to are usually the ones who've been told in 100 small ways to stay quiet. The applause started at one table and spread. Afterward, when the reporters had packed up and the caterers were clearing the final tables, Ambrose crossed the room, past the board members who wanted a word, past the photographers still waiting, and stopped beside Solange. She looked up at him. He offered his hand. She took it, and neither of them let go. That night they stood on the upper terrace of Fallon Tower, the city spread below them in grids of light that ran past the horizon. "I used to think staying useful was the same as being wanted," Solange said. His thumb moved lightly against her hand, and now. She thought about the hospital room, and the conference table covered in timesheets, and the speech he had given in a silent ballroom, and the way he still, every morning without exception, drank whichever tea she'd left outside his door. "Now I think being wanted is when someone looks for you," she said, "not just for what you can carry." He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth, briefly and quietly, to her knuckles. Below them the city hummed and shimmered without end. Neither of them needed to say anything else. For the first time in both their lives, the weight between them wasn't something one person bore alone.